Hi all, apologies in advance for any background noise that may intrude, particularly into today's lecture. This is the time that's available to do it, and we're having some noise from kids today, so that's just the way it's got to be with apologies. All right. Have you noticed that in our first 2 weeks of this class, we have both sung the praises of ambiguity and sung the praises of clarity? Now, this is not at all a contradiction, though ambiguity and clarity are opposites. I usually explain why in my lecture on precision, which is still to come, but for this strange semester, I've actually had to rearrange my usual order of lectures. So I'm going to start today with a preview from my precision handout. Resist ambiguity in your writing, even as you relish in others. Every word in the English language, as all literary scholars know, carries unstable ranges of denotations and connotations. A skilled writer manages those ranges and the reader's perception of them strategically. In poetic and creative writing, the interplay among those meanings can produce rich ambiguities. Literary scholarship, whose purpose is to interpret and analyze such ambiguities, must be especially careful to be as unambiguous as possible in its expression. And the handout will go on further from there when we get there. So, as opposed to creative writing, good academic writing, or any writing whose purpose is to communicate or argue something true, should always strive to be clear and unambiguous. To do otherwise would be insincere. That's true at every level, though the point is more debatable at the highest levels of literary scholarship, where some writers do experiment with academic form. For undergraduate scholarly writing about literature, clarity is absolute, because since you're describing literary ambiguities, you must be unambiguous, utterly clear in your discussion of them. Robert Lowth begins his tract on clarity, that is, on grammar, by responding to public charges by Swift and others that, quote, the imperfect state of our language has offended against every part of grammar. As Lowth interprets those charges, it means that even the most highbrow usages of English, in writers recognized as the best, can be ungrammatical. And no, he does not give any room for the fact that language is in its nature irregular and capricious. Now that construction right here is telling in its antitheses. That is, its opposites, right? The opposites of irregular and capricious would be, let's say, regular and thoroughly predictable. The grammatical use of English for Lowth, as he explains again and again, should be regular and thoroughly predictable in its systematic logic. Grammar, which for Lowth, as he says, means the art of rightly expressing our thoughts by words, is about accuracy. For Lowth, it should make perfect sense the way a math problem does. Grammar should make sense for Lowth and be symmetrical in its patterns. Irregularities should be cleaned up wherever possible, but not so far as to make them seem unintelligible or strange to a majority of then current speakers. So for Lowth, thus, if I can say, the dog had bitten me, then I should be able to say, the dog had sitten on the ground. He calls sitten the true participle, even though it was not in use and still is not. The most irregular verbs are, for Lowth, defective. But these are, of course, too entrenched in everyday usage for him to try to change. I hope you are as amused as I always am to note that the rules that we now generally consider grammatical or proper in present-day English, and thus most sensible, have changed in many ways since Lowth wrote. We don't use long S forms anymore, for starters. Then again, we can lament, rightly, some of the changes that Lowth was trying to keep from changing, but which have changed anyway. For instance, notice that Lowth has the benefit of a distinction between Lowth has the benefit of a distinction between plural and singular second-person pronouns, right? Where Lowth can speak to one person as thou, and multiple people as ye or ye. We are generally stuck with using you in either case. So, as a result, our present-day grammar is less clear and thus less grammatical by Lowth's definition, than Lowth's earlier version of grammar was. And again, these forms were already fading out of usage while he was writing. He's trying to preserve them, right? I hope you see why this added distinction, this added shade of distinction, right? I'm speaking to one person, I say thou. I'm speaking to many people, I say ye or you, etc. Allows for grammar to be clearer. Grammar is clearer by making more available shades of distinction. It is something that I personally wish we still had. And in fact, you may see that in my classes, I use the word y'all to refer to more than one person when I'm speaking in the second person, though that's not always recognized in standard English. So it's by that kind of logic, the idea that more regularity and more available shades of distinction allow speakers to communicate more clearly, that Lowth's semi-contemporaries introduce, say, the possessive form its, right? So the book has its cover. That possessive would eventually be confused with the contraction of it is as its. But they didn't have the word its as in the book, look at the book has its cover fallen off or something like that. You didn't have that possessive its before Lowth and his contemporaries sort of forcibly added it by way of their logic. It's by that same logic that I and other present-day grammarians insist in my own writing, and not in my undergraduates, but in my own, on the distinction between who and whom, right, as does Lowth. Though Lowth here accepts ending a clause on a preposition, which I don't in my writing when I can avoid it. He calls it less graceful, at least. Lowth really dislikes when authors' usage treats the simple past and past participle as one, right? You remember, assuming you've read it already, you'll remember that he has Milton saying had spoke instead of had spoken, right? By saying spoke is the same as had spoke, rather than making it had spoken, that removes a shade of distinction that grammar makes possible. So he gets really intense about this. Lowth says, "This abuse has long been growing on us and is continually making further encroachments. Its absurdity is wholly inexcusable and barbarous." So he doesn't like things that conflate together. He's not a fan of conflating adjectives with adverbs either. So take note that Lowth's appeals to logic and to universal grammar, the idea under it, are in many ways aimed at those who would learn English as a foreign language, and more overtly to those native English speakers who seek to learn other languages, especially Latin, or to, as he puts it, quote, the learner even of the lowest class. For all of these, Lowth is trying to ensure that those language learners do not come away, as so many English learners still do, feeling that English grammar just doesn't make any sense. We've heard these complaints before. Lowth asserts it does make sense if only our best writers would just follow the sensible rules that are inherent to the language. But is Lowth right? Is he right that grammar, the art of rightly and clearly expressing our thoughts by words, should strive for symmetrical regularity and for mathematically organized shades of distinction above all else? Consider one of Lowth's key sentences in his introduction. The second of the two I've presented here, right, the one that begins of. Read this second sentence out loud to yourself. Right now, read it. What? I'll read it to you, maybe with careful intonation here. Of all the ancient languages extant, that is the most simple, which is undoubtedly the most ancient. But even that language itself does not equal the English in simplicity. Our modern standard English would at least ask Lowth to add a comma after extant here. That would help. Make it clearer that he's saying, of all the ancient languages extant, that is, pause, that is the most simple, which is undoubtedly the most ancient, right? But look at how mathematical he's being in his thought here. He chooses that, as in that language, because in this usage, that must refer to a single understood reference, otherwise it would be those. And since no other referent has been named yet, but we've already named a group of surviving ancient languages, subordinated by way of, we must naturally be able to understand the construction as that of all the ancient languages extant is the most simple. That of all the ancient languages extant is the most simple, which is undoubtedly the most ancient. It is grammatically thus technically, mathematically correct. He is following a regular logic here. But in so doing, he's ignoring the fact that the word that has multiple other uses, so that its ordering of words here ends up confusing more than it clarifies. And yes, it would have been confusing to Lowth's contemporaries too. We read it first, and you may have read it first, as, of all the ancient languages extant, that is the most simple. Wait, then we think, shouldn't be of all the ancient languages extant that are the most simple? And then we think, wait, what? And above all of that, Lowth never specifies which language he means. The most ancient. Is it Biblical Hebrew? Is it Greek? Both choices would be justifiable given his array of citations later in his book. Maybe he meant to signal here that the reader should already know which language he means. That's why he leaves it implicit, but he doesn't say that. And so in signaling that the reader should already know, he's asking his sentence to do more than communicate clearly. He's trying to insert a kind of distinction here, which means he's being insincere because he's being unclear. Whether that means he's being ungrammatical here is a point of philosophical debate, which I'll be glad to take up in office hours if you like. But my point here is that in choosing technical mathematical correctness, right, technically the sentence does hold together. In choosing technical grammatical correctness over clarity of thought, here and elsewhere, Lowth is in this case not using his grammar as well as he could. After all, it is, he says, the art of rightly expressing thoughts. Grammar should be the art of rightly expressing thoughts. And remember, Lowth has identified the learner even of the lowest class as his audience. So this stuff with not saying what language he's talking about, but referring to it as that, but not specifying the that, and not making clear that the that has a referent rather than being the introduction of an inna, that's not sincere use of grammar, and it's not clear. For clear grammar, truly, and of course Lowth is very clear in other places, but for the clearest grammar, I offer as a counterexample the writing of Carol Percy on Lowth. Let me give you some examples. Robert Lowth's short introduction to English grammar is best known for innovatively demonstrating that the English language as it stands. Let me start that again, actually. Robert Lowth's short introduction to English grammar is best known for innovatively demonstrating that the English language, as it stands in the writings of our most approved authors, oftentimes offends against every part of grammar. In the footnotes, or critical notes, Lowth enumerated the grammatical errors of classic past non-living authors, although some quotations illustrating good usage appeared in the main text. Lowth's method, as Tikenboon von Ostad has persuasively argued, refuted Johnson's claim that usage, quote, can only be learned by the distinct consideration of particular words as they are used by the best authors. I've made a cut here. In this article, I demonstrate that examples of bad grammar from vernacular classics, though new to the genre of English grammar, were a well-known element of debates about translating the Bible and editing Shakespeare. In the conclusion, I draw on current studies of literary canons to argue that by crystallizing the difference between literary language and standard language, Lowth's grammar emphasized the difficulty and thus the cultural value of both. By the way, notice that that Percy here is using I, and that she has a particularly exemplary, clear parallel structure in this final sentence. And what Percy promises to do here in her thesis statement is what she does. At the time she is writing, Lowth is best known for his innovation. Percy demonstrates that those techniques known for being innovative in Lowth were actually already well known in discourse among translators and editors. They were only new to the genre of English grammar. Now, you might have skated by the word innovatively here. Perhaps because you've become accustomed in cheaper writing to authors using vaguely complimentary adverbs to puff out their prose, or perhaps because you were reading while distracted. But when Percy says innovatively demonstrating, she means it. The point is that what Lowth's demonstrations are known for is being innovative. Look too at persuasively, just down here, right? Von Ostad has persuasively argued. Right after that word appears, and there's a bit of a cut in the quote, Percy starts to break down some of prior scholars' assumptions about Lowth's innovations. But we proceed through that argumentation of Percy's with no expectation that it will invalidate argumentation like von Ostad's, because Percy has still, at the time of writing, found it persuasive. It's not an empty adverb that we might add in to just puff things out. She's saying it's persuasive because it's important to her argument to establish that it is to her persuasive. And she's saying it's innovatively because it is crucial to her argument to put the question of Lowth's innovation on the table. Right? You might say, well, how am I supposed to know that? The simple answer is, that's what innovatively and persuasively mean. Percy's grammar, unlike Lowth, is about choosing and ordering words truly in the interest of clear expression. She says what she means throughout. She says nothing more. If you read as much academic prose as I do, you would know how admirable that is. It is precisely where you should aim in your own essay writing. Part of what makes that clarity possible is that Percy is writing here quite clearly to an audience of fellow linguistic historians who will generally already know Lowth and know why he is known. This is an article that's published in the journal Historiographia Linguistica, right? Historical linguistics. Were she to write to a broader audience, I think Percy would likely have chosen to frame this key point about Lowth's innovation just a bit more aggressively from the top. What she's chosen here, in contrast to Lowth's own writing, is pitch perfect for the clear communication of ideas to an audience of specialists. First sentence establishes he's best known for innovatively demonstrating, etc. What I will demonstrate is that his examples, while they were new to the genre of English grammar, were well known. Right? And she goes on from there. Note too, by the way, that this is for an audience of specialists, but she has nowhere, here or throughout the article, deployed any jargon, even when speaking to an audience of specialists. She is clear, so we can all read her, if we are reading slowly and with attention. I don't mean to suggest that Percy, in her straightforward clarity, has no fun, or that she's dry. You may have noticed in her conclusion, Pope mocked his competitor editors for their historicist learning. Right? A construction that makes really clear who Pope is talking to and what he's doing, right? His competitor editors, but also that does it in a way that sounds, as you'll see in your reading from Pope next week, a bit like Pope's own poetry, competitor editors. Or look at the beginning of section 2. All right? I quite like this. Contemporary reviews of Lowth's grammar suggest that its critical notes must have been notable. There's a light punning going on here. The notes are notable, but crucially, that punning serves the progression of her argument without slowing it down. No clarity is lost, and actually, the pun makes things clearer. The notes were noteworthy, notable, but that is different from being innovative. Right down here, neither reviewer identifies the notes as innovative, but both emphasize them in the structure of their reviews. Right? From there, with the subject of Lowth's perceived innovativeness thrown into question, Percy proceeds with equal clarity through the bulk of her essay, or through her article, which is dedicated to where Lowth did get his ideas. Section 3, she says Lowth's attention to biblical language in his grammar reflected broader debates at his time about the appropriateness of the 1611 translation, the King James translation, in mid-18th century Britain, and she describes those in detail. Section 4, she says Lowth's principal inspiration for literary quotations, as opposed to religious quotations, must have been, as we already know, Johnson's 1755 dictionary, Johnson's famous dictionary. And some of Johnson's innovations, incidentally, were also, she argues, drawn from continental traditions. She writes Johnson's plan for that dictionary already set up the idea of using negative examples from great writers, right? That's the supposed innovation, to use negative examples from great writers. Johnson's plan had already set up that idea, as had other dictionary writers. But the key is that for Johnson, bad grammar is excused because of poetic license and because of the unpredictability and capriciousness of the language, which we know Lowth disagrees with. Section 5... Did I skip section 4? Oh, no, I did. I just said section 4. Okay, sorry about that. Section 5, right there, right? She continues that there's also, right, in addition to the influences or the sources that Lowth is drawing from for his supposed innovation, both from biblical criticism, from people talking about the right way to translate the Bible, and from Johnson's example in the treatment of literature and other dictionary writers. Here in section 6, is that right? Yes. Here in section 6, sorry, it's hard to see at the same time. I'm sorry. Here in section 5, she also says that there's a then ongoing debate about the better way to edit great English writers, right? Shakespeare, Milton. She says that the critical editing of vernacular literature, of English literature, I quote Percy here, is a significant and hitherto unrecognized, or at least under-recognized, influence on Lowth's critical notes, which is a result of a boom contemporaneous with Lowth in the market value and availability of new editions of English literature, in which, in those editions, editors used often grammatical logic to justify the changes and corrections that they were making to the great English literature of the past, and then they were later criticized by that same logic for corrupting those texts. Section 6 talks about contemporaneous book reviewers, who often criticized authors' grammar by, again, that similar logic, and one of whom actually criticized Lowth's lack of notes in a prior book, which likely influenced how Lowth did his notes, including his omission of negative examples from living writers. So thus, Percy covers thoroughly all the ways in which innovative is probably the wrong word to apply to Lowth's use of negative examples in his critical notes. Rather, critical notes that Lowth uses were informed by ongoing discussion and drawn out of it. A side point, by the way, on Percy's clarity of thought with respect to specificity, which we've already talked about. Percy never generalizes without numbers to back up her generalization. Did you notice that? She never says, most of Lowth's quotations from the Bible are positive examples. She says, I quote, the first edition of Lowth's grammar contained more quotations from the English Bible than from any other author. Although this includes not only negative but positive examples. Of 48 quotations, only 23 are critical. The numbers. She does not say, critics said Lowth was X. She cites specific reviews of what critics said. Critic by critic. You should learn from this not only that you should feel free to use accounting and accounting of examples numerically in your own writing. You can do that at the undergraduate level too. How many examples and how many of those examples support your point. But also that you should emulate that kind of precise specificity that Percy so does. Undergraduate writers often err into wretchedly general constructions. I've seen so many times that undergraduate writers use, it has been said that, or readers believe that, or many critics have said, and then the many critics is justified with a single quotation from one critic. Whenever you are tempted to generalize, you should think about and emulate Percy instead. And that brings us, by the way, to Percy's conclusion. Sorry for the noise, in which she gets her most intricate and deep work done. As Percy puts it, the cultural climate, here near the bottom, the cultural climate was changing in a way that seemed favorable to scholars. So despite Pope's earlier mockery of competitor editors' long footnotes, Lowth's grammar, moving up the page, Lowth's grammar was received favorably, not only in spite of the text's pedantry, but also because of it. As promised, Percy, in this conclusion, Percy's conclusion draws on current studies of literary canons to argue that what Lowth's grammar did do was to crystallize the difference between literary language and standard language, emphasizing the difficulty and thus the cultural value of both. Think about the difference between innovating or inventing something and crystallizing something, making something solid from what was already floating all around you. And that's precisely her point. It is there that Lowth deviates from Johnson's positive examples from great literature, right? Lowth's grammar helped to entrench the cultural cachet of vernacular classic literature by emphasizing its remoteness from modern life, and thus the specialist literacy and learning necessary to understand and appreciate it. Percy's excellent conclusion, like any good essay conclusion, including yours, goes a bit beyond what her thesis statement promises in order to open outward and provoke further discussion. Her final sentence here is one of the best closing sentences we'll read this semester. But rather than read it to you, I'd like to challenge you. Rather than read it to you, I'd like to challenge you. Sorry about that. I'd like to challenge you to do something before we meet. And before we meet Carol Percy, who will be our guest respondent on Wednesday. There's two small things to do after reading the Percy article. First, As we already say on the syllabus, I want you to generate thoughtful questions for Professor Percy about the craft of writing, about the article you read, about your own experience of grammar, about Lowth, if you wish. But I also want you to take a few moments now to read Percy's introduction and discussion and conclusion out loud. I mean, read it out loud. Go off and read it out loud. In doing so, pay attention to when, whether, and how you stumble or need to double back over a sentence in order to understand it. Compare its clarity to that of the Monsanto ad that we read briefly in class. It's a way to get to know your own reading practice and the way you attend to and absorb readings a bit more closely. And by the way, when you do this reading aloud, you must eliminate any distractions. You must eliminate any distractions that you can. Close all other windows and block out noise. And if you have kids in the house, good luck to you. You should always be eliminating distractions when you read and when you write, but especially now. Pay attention to what windows you have open. Pay attention to the other things you're doing at the same time. Think about what you're listening to if you're listening to something. So, read Percy aloud in this way. It's a great way to get Percy's clear grammar and style into your own mental muscles a bit. And that is exactly where you want to be as a writer right now.